it's important to take those comments in the context of, first of all, Ben Wallace's strong personal support for Ukraine over the last year and a bit since the renewed invasion, February 2022, but also the UK's wider response as a government. So I don't think Ben Wallace was saying this in a sense of frustration or anger on his part or the UK government's part, but rather I think it was a kind of recommendation to the Ukrainians to be politically aware and politically savvy in their own kind of signalling and communications. So obviously we have to bear in mind that allies in Europe, and particularly in the United States, have their own domestic political situations to deal with. And so the governments, say in the White House in the US, are, facing some questions from people, particularly in the Republican Party and in the run-up to an election, about what the future level of support looks like, how expansive that should be, under what conditions it should come. And I think it was really a kind of expression that the Ukrainians need to recognize that there are a lot of pressures on the governments giving them aid, and that it's not as straightforward as there's always more to provide. A lot of these countries are running down their own stockpiles of weapons and munitions. They're also suffering kind of significant cost of living crises and all of these other things that are on politicians' mind. And so I think they should be taken in that context. It's not necessarily a sign of war fatigue. It's more a sense that those kind of difficult domestic politics around giving weapons and other financial and other forms of aid need to be carefully managed, and that sometimes comments from outside of a country are not always going to play as well inside a country as people might like.
On the battlefield, it's been reported there's been a stalemate situation in Bakhmut and very few gains made on either side.
I think it's really important to kind of manage expectations. We obviously saw really rapid Ukrainian breakthroughs in some of their counteroffensives earlier in this conflict, particularly in the kind of northeast of the country. And that, I think, has set some expectations, particularly around the kind of domestic audiences in the West, that this is going to be some sort of kind of lightning blitzkrieg war. And we're going to see some calamitous kind of instant collapse of Russian resistance. Now, to be clear, that's always a possibility, but the reality is always a bit more complex and uncertain. The Russians have had all sorts of problems with their performance on the battlefield, not just the land forces, but also the performance of the air and maritime forces as well. Those are issues with training, with organization, with logistics, with leadership, communications, the list goes on. At the same time, have had a lot of time to dig in. They have kind of defenses in depth in terms of trenches and other sorts of kind of concrete pillboxes, these sorts of things that they've been building up, knowing that a Ukrainian counteroffensive was coming. And so it's always going to be a kind of difficult, grinding, bloody fight, unfortunately, particularly given the kind of disparities in terms of the size of the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces, the weapons that are available on each side, the fact that the Ukrainians don't have kind of air superiority or anything like that, and they are fighting, and therefore in many ways an uphill battle in a lot of areas. So they are doing well. They are obviously trying to progress on a number of fronts and to try and kind of tease and test at Russian defenses, pitting the Russian defenders in a variety of locations, and then trying to figure out where the best place would be to make a breakthrough. It's too early to say really where that's going to come, because a lot of it will depend, of course, on how kind of individual units along the front line perform, whether they break in their morale and allow a Ukrainian kind of breakthrough, these sorts of issues. But I think we're going to continue to see a lot of pressure from the Ukrainians on the Russian position. And clearly they want to demonstrate not just themselves that they can retake their territory and kind of liberate many of their citizens in the east and the south, but also that they can show to kind of Western donors that they're putting their weapons and training and intelligence to good use and able to make good progress against the Russians. So I think it's too early to tell how this is going to play out and indeed how long the conflict is going to last. The key message, though, is that it's something that the Ukrainians have learned a lot over the last 18 months, but so have the Russians. And so they shouldn't be discounted, and an easy victory shouldn't be taken for granted, certainly.